All right, we're going to take a look at the next chapter. We're going to go into Reconstruction and also cover what's going on out west in the late 1800s and up until about 1900. But there's really no end date for those. Now, as we talk about Reconstruction, there is a clear beginning and there is a clear end. And of course, the clear beginning to Reconstruction is the end of the Civil War. The end of Reconstruction actually comes about with a presidential election. In the election of 1876, there was a controversial winner, and so the two political parties, the Democrats representing the South and the Republicans representing the North, got together and figured out who won that election, and in exchange for that, also brought about the end of Reconstruction. So when we take a look at Reconstruction, first of all, we want to take a look at the problems that were going on and the questions that needed to be solved. The first question that needed to be solved was, what do we do with these ex-Confederates? Mainly Jefferson Davis was going to be an issue. He was a former senator for the United States, and then when the Confederacy breaks away, he becomes the Confederate president. The Republicans in Congress wanted to punish all those who had left. And when you enter into Congress, you take an oath of office that says that you are going to uphold the Constitution. These people had broken that oath, and so they needed to have some sort of punishment for that. Jefferson Davis tries to escape as the Civil War is going on. One of the more famous stories is that he put on a woman's dress in order to try and get through the Union Army. He obviously fails. He's captured and he's put into prison for 2 years. The 14th Amendment would be passed, which would prevent any of those who led the Confederate States or any of those who had taken a previous oath of office to the United States from serving again in the government. Lincoln was of the opinion that the South couldn't ever legally break away anyway, and so it didn't matter what these people had done. Johnson, a Southern Democrat, wants to be very forgiving and wants to continue Lincoln's policies, but the radical Republicans in Congress were unwilling to compromise, were unwilling to forgive, and wanted to punish the South and change Southern society. One of the ways that they wanted to do that was by punishing those Confederate leaders. And so when they passed the 14th Amendment, which does not take a presidential signature, the 14th Amendment was passed and prevented those who had been in Confederate office from, again, holding office in the United States. And so all of those former senators, all of those politicians, all of those leaders were not going to be allowed. Robert E. Lee, his citizenship was finally reinstated. In fact, the two major leaders, Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee, they had their citizenship stripped from them by the Republican Congress, and Jefferson Davis's citizenship is given back to him about 10 years later, I believe. But Robert E. Lee was not forgiven by Congress formally until 1975. Jefferson Davis was given full rights of citizenship again in 1978, although he was elected to the Senate in 1874, and so that was a controversial issue. Congress got around to finally bringing back all of these ex-Confederates in limited capacities about 30 years later in the 1890s. Enough time had passed, and Democrats from the South were again able to wield a lot of influence in Congress in order to make those changes. The 13th Amendment is ratified in 1865. This is the first thing that we need to do. It abolishes slavery. It was passed by Republican governments being run by Northerners in the South, and so it was able to be passed by a majority of states. in terms of actually rebuilding the South, the biggest issues are rebuilding the South economically. They had heavily relied on agriculture before the Civil War, and agriculture was going to be a large part of the rebuilding process. But once the Union armies ripped through the South, they destroyed a lot of stuff. They destroyed a lot of their economic power. They destroyed a lot of these farms. And even if these farms weren't destroyed, the men who had worked the farms, those poor Southern whites, had gone on to the war, gone on to fight, and so a lot of those farms were just left in ruins and natural decay. In places where slaves had run the farms, they fared a little bit better, and yet once the Union armies came through and those slaves left, those farms fell into disrepair as well. The Southern economy, banking system was totally destroyed by poor management. We talked about during the Civil War that they paid for the war by printing their own money and printing a lot of their own money. When they print their own money, it leaves those Southern banks in ruins. There wasn't a way to really make a profit off of that. And so the banking system was in shambles. Factories, what few factories there were in the South, were closed. A lot of them were destroyed because they were focused in the factories were located in the cities, and any factories that could be converted to wartime efforts were, and so the Union Army destroyed those factories on their way through because they didn't want that production to be going towards helping the South. And any railroads that would have helped the South fight in the war were destroyed by Union armies, and so those railroads needed to be rebuilt. Now, the nice thing is that by destroying all this stuff, it gives us an opportunity to rebuild in a more systematic fashion. Factories can be built in the cities. Cities that were completely destroyed, like Atlanta and Richmond, could be rebuilt from the ground up. And so instead of having these old world cities that just kind of sprawled all over the place, you could build a unified grid-like city, a more modern city, and relocate all of those things that you need in order to provide better services. And so if you visit Atlanta today, the city is set up like you would see modern cities of the West being built. It allows us to rebuild transportation. It allows us to rebuild the factories. And so we're able to rebuild the South from the ground up. And so there was something good that came out of Reconstruction, but it would be a long process along the way.